Blacksmith of the Apocalypse. By Arcuser. Chapter 1031 On the Streets. As Tyr's gavel turned another cultivator into a bloom of blood mist, he already felt the attack of the next one bashing against his back. It wasn't strong enough to overcome the defense of his armor, but it angered him slightly. With a backhand swing, there was another puddle of blood on the street. Galwell was already a little pissed because he missed part of the final and had to watch the rest on the public screen in the Pythian Plaza and not live. But ultimately he was glad that he had listened to Seth and his people. Before the final ended, Gamma Resistance and the Boulder Guild had assembled their men in the Pythian village and spread across the city to prevent collateral damage and casualties among the public. When the swarm of cultivators appeared in the sky, about every third cultivator and a bunch of foreign adventurers started attacking people and the infrastructure at random. Casting skill for wide area destruction, or sneak attacking pedestrians. It was a good thing most players vanished the moment the announcements rang. Only a few suffered from sneak attacks. Galwell and the people of Gamma Resistance were deployed around the Pythian Plaza, the biggest square in the village and the biggest venue for public viewing. It wasn't so he could watch the rest of the final, at least it wasn't the only reason. Once the battle began, the plaza fit the criteria of a battlefield. It was the best place to max out the effects of his skills as the chosen of Tyr, the god of war and justice. Apart from leadership buffs to his men, the trait Men of War also triggered. The average level of the attackers was 75, not weak at all, but with the various battlefield buffs even the ordinary members of Gamma Resistance were able to go toe-to-toe with most of the attackers, allowing the people not involved to evacuate. They jumped in to prevent damage, but in many cases, the intervention of the guards or guilds wasn't even needed. The Pythian village wasn't a place ordinary citizens of Little Gamma would come without confidence in protecting themselves. Instead of running, many would join them in defending. It was a scene, not too uncommon across the Pythian village. The members of the guilds and the guards stopped the initial surprise attack across the city, preventing a panic. The tourists, the visitors, and even some of the residents who migrated here joined the battle after the initial surprise was gone, angered by the sneak attacks, the overall situation, or the damage to their property. Not everyone was so righteous that they would join the defense battle, or petty enough to turn around and stab their attacker in the back, the moment they got distracted. While Galwell and the people of the guilds concentrated on fighting, many of the guards focused on evacuating the uninvolved citizens left in the Pythian village. These consisted mostly of cultivators that had come here for business, or to watch the tournament. Of course, they couldn't just let this crowd of people enter Little Gamma. This was why they had prepared several shelters across the Pythian village with smaller barriers, to house the certified visitors and business owners. Despite that, a large number of guards were bound at the pathway to cross barriers to enter Little Gamma. Not because there was a strenuous process of checking passports or something like that. People without permission to enter Little Gamma would simply bounce off the city barrier, unable to cross, anyway. The pathway was clogged up by people who had no entry permission and decided to stay and argue with the guards, to gain access to Little Gamma, blocking the few people with permission who couldn't use home call. There is nothing we can do about it. If you didn't get the permit through official channels, you aren't able to cross the barrier, the guards kept repeating. They didn't have the means, much less the permission or will to let random people flood into Little Gamma. Not that they would have if they could. The guards were also local adventurers. They were clear about the chance that many of these people were spies, trying to get in and cause havoc. Despite their insistence that there was nothing they could do, the people stayed and argued, holding up the whole operation, maybe even on purpose. "Let me in. I said let me in. I will not die in this place," a man in blue robes screeched, pulling out the saber from the sheath at his hip. The moment the weapon left the sheath, the man lost consciousness and crumbled to the ground like a sack of potatoes. A figure had appeared behind him and K.O.ed him in a single strike. "Listen here, you maggots. If you have no permission to enter Little Gamma, then fuck off. Right now, nothing stops you from just leaving the Pythian village and going outside. If you don't want to do that either, then step aside and stop causing trouble. Otherwise, you will end up like him and who knows what will happen to him," the pissed Kate ordered the crowd. She had large rings under her eyes. After being pulled off from the duty of protecting the construction site, she became the leader of the covered operations. Lena didn't blame her for what she did, and in many ways, this was a promotion. It was just so tiresome lately. She had not slept in days. Seeing this crowd of people just irked her to no end, on top of her already aggravated, sleep-deprived state. It reminded her too much of the last days in Gamma. "You can't do this. You can't treat us like that. Do you know who I am? Obviously, a bunch of them were unwilling to take the order lying down. They quickly joined the first guy, literally taking the order lying down. Seeing her quickly deal with insurgents, the crowd fell silent. I will not argue about this. If you have no permit and stay to cause trouble, I will floor you and throw you outside the barrier myself. Everyone else get in line and leave quickly, she shouted for everyone to hear, further silencing the crowd. With a sharp glare, the guards who had hesitated for a moment, also started ushering people to form orderly lines and sending them through the gateway. Delta. Perturbed, he looked to the sky above Delta. The clouds were hanging deep, swallowing the peak of the volcano the city snuggled up to and hiding the floating peaks in the surroundings. The sunset had colored them crimson, but something didn't seem right about the shade of red to be just the light of the sunset. Rich stood at the window of his office on the 10th floor of the Parliament building. As the last remaining member of the original evaluation team that followed the instructions of Delta's Parliament, he was always on standby in case there was an attack on the Assembly. Ever since the sudden attack on Arjit Noor by a yet-to-be-identified force, the Assembly members were practically living in the Parliament to come up with assistance and defense measures. As they stayed here, so did he and his team. There was another meeting right now. But this time they were not talking about the undead. It was probably to watch the final of the Pythian game with bated breath. They didn't want to admit it, but Myanmar had long outgrown them. Adventurers and people with talent, striving for a greater future, would ultimately choose to leave Delta and live in one of the tree stations. Rich couldn't blame them. Maybe he would have left, too, but the offer he got here was too good to leave. Since the attack on the granaries, things had gradually become worse in Delta. Lately, there had also been complaints from and against the forces of Krina stationed in Delta. Despite half their force in Delta being made up of people recruited here, public opinion had taken a weird turn, and in answer to that, soldiers also complained about their treatment. It was like someone was manipulating public opinion to drive a wedge between Delta and the Krina Empire. The slave Mansur couldn't help but suspect the new ambassador of Krina. At least it felt like things had gotten worse since he arrived. His attitude in meetings and on official events also wasn't very diplomatic. It was clear that he didn't like Earth and would randomly find details to pick on or bring up previous failings. However, he was nothing more than a glorified bodyguard. His opinion didn't matter to the big shots, or they also knew but decided to stay silent. Either way, it didn't take much to see the Delta was caught in a downward spiral ever since Princess Lena wasn't in charge. With idle thoughts, his eyes wandered over the city skyline in the distance. On the opposite side of the city was demon territory. The weird spires and eccentric alteration to the original city building had turned the demon district into a site that wouldn't get boring. His eyes focused on a pillar of bright red smoke rising between the high-risers of the demon district. Another new feature. What exactly were the demons doing this time? Was it the start of another radical change like the part of the city enchanted with eternal shadows? Rich was wasting his time thinking about the red smoke when he heard a great outcry from the assembly hall. With a swift move, he charged into the chamber, to find the politicians fixated on the hologram in the center. It showed the Pythian village, surrounded by a foreign fleet of flying vessels and cultivators. Little Gamma was being attacked. Chapter 1132a. Setting the stage. Could he really do this? No, he had to. He didn't believe the lies. The scene would have never betrayed them. Myanmar destroyed Y City for their own gain. The peaceful atmosphere on the surface couldn't deceive him. All these people herded into their tree stations, and used like cattle or slaves to farm gold for them. Secretly, Myanmar had seized control over Earth. With Delta faltering, they were aiming for world domination. It was clear as day to him. They had to be stopped. He would stop them. It wasn't hard to play along with their charade. A smile here, a handshake there. Playing along with disgustingly sweet and happy conversations until he finally was in the position he was now. His fingers flitted across the control console of the shield generator. This was the eye of just one of the many barrier formations that protected Little Gamma and the Pythian village. His own efforts would bring them to fall, but he was just a small cog. There were many like him. The moment the signal was given, he had come here to power down the generators and welcome their liberators from the voracious cloud continent. With their help, they would. A piercing pain in his chest had him cramping up, punching a bunch of gibberish into the console. Had he been found out? A violent cough splattered his blood across the generator. So this was how he would die. Perpetrator apprehended successfully. proceeding to shut down generator for recalibration, an emotionless voice as he was violently thrown to the side, he saw it was one of the golems of Minas Mar, still carrying the bloodied sword it used to stab him. Why? Why would they kill him only to continue what he was already doing? Umi watched the situation in shock. Lena, the princess from Krina, had warned her that there might be some disturbances during the later stages of the games, but the anchor thought the demon would be the worst of it all. She never expected an army, led by a legend, to attack the Pythian village. She would not have agreed to work here if she had known beforehand. The weird thing was, that she would have thought that she would be in more of a panic at this point. However, "Please stay in your seats, we have everything under control," the oath guards kept repeating as they walked around the audience stands, calming down people. There had been a few moles that tried to cause a ruckus, but they had been apprehended without being able to cause any harm. The village had a shield and the arena was armored like a tortoise too, instilling confidence into her. Maybe not even an immortal could get through them. Most of all, at no point did the Tower Master seem flustered. He even went ahead and started accusing the enemy of crimes, which made her shudder and angry. They were facing an army with a legendary warrior at their helm, but Minas Mar didn't seem fazed by this. Maybe this was why she was able to remain calm. It wasn't just her, even the audience seemed more confused than in a panic. Well, most of them wouldn't be able to recognize a legend either. Still, they treated the scenes on the screen more like a final show, than an actual danger. The bird-eye view of the attack was breathtaking, and now the big hero, Python, had finally appeared, too. Standing on the arena, she inched closer to the Tower Master. She wanted to ask. There had to be a plan. He was too calm to lack a plan. They had even prepared a list of crimes. What exactly is the plan? She whispered to him, but halted when her heart jumped. The thick shield that covered the Pythian village and which had easily blocked the legend's attack had suddenly vanished. It was clear to see on the screens around the stadium and in the sky above them their greatest defense was gone. In a slight panic, she turned to the Tower Master, however, he didn't seem perturbed at all. Finally, Dumting rejoiced as the great barge, the fleet, and the swarm of cultivators moved into the airspace above the Pythian village. They were like a swarm of locusts, descending on a field to ravage and devour the crop. However, the crop Dumting was after, the weak and the easy prey, were already gone. Not there were many in the Pythian village, to begin with. But the only people left on the streets were cultivators, adventurers, and guards, still fighting. They came to loot and pillage, but there wasn't much to loot and pillage at this stage. While many of the individual cultivators and weaker disciples of the sects descended to join the street battles, the attention of the fleet was on the reason for the village's existence. "Attack the stadium," elders and squad leaders commanded their men. Yes. The biggest and juiciest fruit left in the Pythian village was the stadium, luring the locust like a plum, ripe fruit, despite its hard shell. Dumting followed without doubts. They were thousands, and they were led by elders in spirit-severing realm and above. How long could it take to cut into the hard shell and feast on the nectar of violence? Although many used the excuse of righteousness, but he didn't. He was honest with himself. He loved the feeling of ripping apart weaklings with his bare hands. Now the people in the stadium did start getting nervous, seeing the swarm of cultivators in the sky above. Not all of them were powerful players or cultivators. Many were nobles or wealthy merchants from system worlds who enjoyed a good show, or Erdhans who didn't want to miss the event. They weren't able to protect themselves. The previous disturbance was dealt with quickly, so they did not fear the attackers much. But seeing the sky darken with flying shuttles and people standing on swords, Umi had to admit that it was moderately frightening even to her. The arena was now filled with the dampened noise of attacks. The whole fleet bombarded the barrier. Barrages of bright energy attack crashed into the shield above, creating a terrifying firework. The situation on the screens was not much better. Going against her expectations, Python was actually fighting the immortal, but it was clear that the snake was at a disadvantage. After swallowing Yumama, it was almost like the serpent choked and was forced to spit him back out, with only a few rips in his robes. It was followed by a very uneven exchange of long-range attacks, as Yumama stood in the air and kept firing freezing blade energy at the snake, while Python countered with boulder breath, spitting huge amounts of rocks, that met his attack in midair. However, similar to the barrier above the arena slowly weakening under the attack of the swarm, Python accumulated gashes and wounds. She was not a being made of flesh, so no blood flowed, but she looked worse and worse for the wear. Even the Tower Master glared at the screen. Was he finally worried? The only places looking promising were the street battles, where members of the Oath Guard and guilds engaged the swarm and were holding their own pretty well, for now. Suddenly, the Tower Master raised his hand to his COMM link. "All right, if everything is ready, close the barrier," he said calmly, racing a storm in UMI's mind. "Ha! This worm is weaker than I expected," Yuma laughed out loud. He was barely using 40% of his power, easily playing with the Great Guardian Beast. But he decided that it was getting time to end this. He would slay the beast in his next move and join the elders to break the barrier on the stadium. Then he would take that impertinent worm they called the Tower Master and parade his dismembered corpse in the streets of their city. He would make an example out of Minasmar and teach these disgusting animals what it meant to pick a fight with the Silk River sect. Circulating his spiritual energy, he got ready to use a technique to finish off the pile of rubbish they called their guardian beast when his concentration was disrupted. The shield was suddenly up again. He was separated from his subordinates. Chapter 1133 in the skies. Dumting was still on the main barge of the Silk River sect, when the shield suddenly appeared again above them, throwing the cultivators in slight confusion. What was happening? Didn't they destroy the barrier? He gritted his teeth. Had the Silk River's plan been foiled? No, even if they managed to reinstate the barrier, they were already inside. Although Yuma was probably locked out, it wasn't like they needed him to break through this barrier. The fight may be tougher when Minasmar intervened, but they would still manage. He was still rationalizing their current situation when one of the greater shuttles close by was suddenly hit by a beam of light. The roaring power almost turned him deaf, as it pounded against the shuttle's formation shield. An armada of flying vessels had appeared from the direction of the giant tree. This had to be the fleet from Earth he heard about. Had they hid themselves in the crown of the tree? When had they entered the airspace of the Pythian village? Ha! Dumting had seen the fleet from Epsilon before. There was barely half of the fleet present, but even if the full fleet was here, they would have been helplessly outnumbered. What did they think they could do with these few ships? These Erdhans weren't the only ones with shields. They wouldn't be able to harm them anytime soon. In the meantime, their other ships would rip them apart, was what he thought to himself, smugly raising a flag. Now that they were here, they wouldn't just raise the village but also destroy their precious toys. It soothed him slightly, thinking of their faces, once all their hidden cards were gone. A fraction of a second after he thought so, the continuous beam of energy had burned a hole in the shield and pierced the magic shuttle, exploding into a cloud of fire and smoke. Its pieces rained down on the city. His jaw dropped. The next moment several more shuttles were hit by similar energy beams. A quarter of the Erdhan shuttles started firing this kind of energy weapon. "Welcome to the shooting gallery, gentlemen. You are the targets." The voice came from the stadium. It was the same voice that had berated the Sect Alliance not too long ago. The Tower Master had spoken, and with his words, a barrage of attacks rose from the village. The sky darkened with arrows and was illuminated again by bright magic. The airspace above the stadium became chaos. Filling the roofs of buildings close to the stadium were rows upon rows of faceless, armored enemies, firing arrows and magic in the sky. Most of the magic and arrows weren't able to deal much harm to the shuttle or sect elites, but many of the weaker disciples and cannon fodder were taken out of the air. However, the bigger problem was the energy beams shot by the fleet of Epsilon. While the leader still struggled to make a decision and change course to face them, the beams took out one flying barge after another. They had jumped right into a trap. Right before his eyes, Dumting saw an elder in the early spirit-severing realm step forward in an attempt to block one of the beams with his palm technique. Covered in his inherent barrier, empowered by his spiritual power, he blocked the terrifying attack for almost 30 seconds. More than double than some of the formation barriers managed. Despite holding out, the martial artist had to watch in horrified fascination, as the man's palms started disintegrating to coal, beginning from his fingertips, once the 10th second passed. At first, the elder stayed silent in dogged concentration, but as his hand blackened and crumbled, the concentration broke. His last, shameful squeal when his shield broke was cut short as he was swallowed by the beam, and turned to ashes. Horrible, but stupid. Concentrate on the stadium barrier, we will take care of this. 3 other elders volunteered. They evaded the attacks, ignoring the plight of the shuttle owners and crew. They had to get rid of the origin of the beam, the flying vessels of Epsilon. Dumting's heart hardly moved, when the 2 elders that got close to the armada didn't get much further. The two of them were only in the first stage of the spirit severing and couldn't even get past the curtain fire of the other ships protecting the beam shooters. The third elder in the middle stages of spirit severing found an anticlimactic end when he suddenly fell from the sky with an arrow in his head. Dum Ting took a sharp breath. They even had archers powerful enough to one-shot a spirit severing stage elder. Unless the sect leader came back, the martial artist started to worry that they might actually lose at this rate. Just where was Yumama? Forget the arena. We have to take care of that fleet or else we will be picked off one by one. The elders of the sect alliance began reorganizing their approach, facing the attack of the Epsilon fleet. The fate of the ships attacked and the elders that had attacked previously was a grim reminder not to underestimate their opponents. She could hear their call and plans. Had nobody taught them to be a little more covered when talking about their plans? Well, it helped her, so she wouldn't complain. She drew back the string of her bow and cast Silent Death. Letting go, an arrow imbued with death aura was sent flying. Without a sound or a hint of its presence, it was lodged in the back of the head of the man who had just spoken the loudest. The man who had stood on the bow of his own flying barge lost all tension. All the discussion and calls between the cultivators fell silent as their eyes focused on him in shock. Slowly, he fell over the railing of his ship and started his almost comical journey downward. All eyes followed his ungentle tumbling in the air. They flinched when his body unceremoniously hit the ground. In a fraction of a second, one of their elder had lost their life, just like that. When the appearance of the fleet was the signal, then this was the starting shot for what happened next. With the fleet drawing attention and engaging in aerial battles with the enemy vessels, it was time for them to take care of the big fish. The only individual cultivators that would pose a threat to the ships of Epsilon were those who reached the spirit severing stage or above. Drawing the bow of WebNovel again, Lydia cast Opener of Ways, shooting into the sky filled with enemies. Surrounding the arrow were dark veils of wind, the winds of the underworld. Hit by the sudden pillar of death rising to the sky, many cultivators died. Some died directly to the damage of the skill, others from the impact on the ground, after being blown off their flying swords with heavy injury. On the ground, this attack would have blown an 18-meter wide path into enemy ranks, directed at the sky made it even more impressive. What are you waiting for? Get them! Lydia cried out, commanding everyone to engage in combat. Rushing past her were the Oath Guards, the mercenaries they had recruited during the tournament, like Leica, Poulter, Bercy, Aprilvine, and Hannibal Cho, Bart, and the members of Minas Mar that had not left Earth before. Most of them were riding aerial strikers, the terrifying giant dragonfly golems with mantis sickles. Using the path Lydia opened, they rose to the skies, directly infiltrating enemy ranks from behind. Right after the group set off, Lydia also jumped on an unmanned aerial striker and followed them into battle. The whole sequence was broadcast in the stadium, to show the live audience that there was nothing to fear. Everything was under control. However, it had a different effect on some of the people in the stadium. Let me leave, I also want to fight out there, Bartholomew Matthias insisted, seeing that other participants had joined the battle outside. Nam was also ready to join the fight outside, signaling his opinion with a silent nod before the tower master. You called it a shooting gallery, let me also join in, Iblin Godfrey demanded. Well, fine, Caleb, you go with them, Seth gave in. Nam and Caleb would have been part of this anyway if the attack had not happened in the middle of the prize ceremony. Should I also go? Daolun asked hesitant. She didn't owe Minas Mar anything, and it was clear she offered more out of concern that she might not get her prize in the end than care for the actual situation. Nah, they will manage. The situation isn't dire enough that we would have to ask our guests for help, he said, though he was slightly worried about their plans. Why did Python send a representative? Chapter 1134 In the Skies, 2. In the sky, the reinforcements from the arena engaged the swarm of cultivators. Sickle and blade collided, spraying sparks everywhere. The dashing-looking cultivator already had a hard time fending off the attack from the flying striker. He couldn't even react when Bercy leaped off the mount and kicked him in the face with a satisfying crunch, turning his shapely nose into a swollen potato. With a mighty push, the cultivator tumbled to earth, while she made a backflip to land on the aerial striker. She couldn't help the wolfish grin on her face. She didn't mind that most of the guys in the air were not her match, it just made the hunt more fun. She was already aiming for the next target when the hair on her neck suddenly stood on end. Crouching down, she evaded the jaws biting at her neck. She immediately counterattacked, but her attack passed through a black mist. Her canine nose wrinkled. Vampire scum, she exclaimed, ejecting claw aura to blow away the dark mist. A few meters away, a man wearing a wine-red, intricate coat took shape, floating in the air. He was sickly pale and had a pronounced pair of canines. It was Count Knox, from the first round of the tournament. "You dirty mutt, you wrinkled my suit," he cursed her, smoothing his coat. "Not just a bloodsucker, but a Spacian rat, too," Bercy spat out aggressively, despite not being too confident in her victory. Vampires were a tricky opponent. When one didn't have an effective attack, as it would happen, the werewolf lady didn't possess a holy skill. The best she could do was to draw the fight out, and Knox's head suddenly exploded into a cloud of fine crimson mist right before her eyes. Some gory pieces of his brain and skin with hair hit her and got stuck in her fur. She had been barely able to see whips of golden light passing by. The vampire's body plummeted to the ground, while Bercy looked around for the perpetrator. In the corner of her eyes, she saw another streak of light, taking the life of a cultivator in the air. This time she saw where it came from. Down on the ground, not far from the arena's exit, stood Eibelin Godfrey. He waved at the werewolf when he noticed her gaze on him. How terrifying! She had not known that the Crusader was even more dangerous in extreme long-range battle than in the arena. He had killed Knox in a single shot, and this time the vampire was dead for good. In a different place, Lydia had engaged one of the Alliance elders. Under her constant suppressive fire, her opponent had descended to a now empty viewing plaza. There was still fighting in the streets, but this place had emptied quickly when the people on the ground saw the big shot approach. With the sword in hand, instead of floating with it in the air, he blocked her barrage of arrows, at least those he had to dodge to prevent injury. Lydia didn't like it, but she had to admit that her opponent was strong and skilled. Now that they were in the place, her opponent rushed forward to engage in a melee fight. A sound decision. In close range the bow was not as effective of a weapon, giving him an advantage. What he didn't expect was that following him to the ground was Lydia's plan all along. The sharp sword, skillfully wielded in a synergy of martial arts and spiritual energy, was crudely smacked away by the violent bash of the bat. Since the bat came out, Lydia had no intention to show mercy. Skillfully weaving her divine skill with the power of gravity bat and the trait of Kanabo demon, she unleashed a series of brutal strikes. She could feel her opponent tremble in fear when he tried to block her strikes. The chosen of WebNovel didn't aim for him but was deliberately aiming for his sword. Whenever he tried to execute a technique, the bat would strike down. Over and over until the sword finally flew out of his hand. The blood of his own ripped and torn palm had cost him his weapon. The unarmed opponent quickly faced the horror of the bat, at least it was over quickly. She had no time for recovery, or rather, it was not given to her. "Oh, a contest of blunt weapon? Challenge accepted." She had just ended the elder of the whatever sect when she heard someone talk. Accompanying the sentence was an almost imperceptible strike aimed at her head. The incredible speed made her unable to react in time. She already saw him live shooting by, when the cudgel was stopped right before her eyes. She looked up to get a clear sight of her attacker. It was a slender cultivator in an uncharacteristically green armor with golden ornaments. His face was hidden by the wooden mask of a monkey face, fitting his wild short hair rising skyward. In the corner of her eyes, she saw what had stopped the cudgel. A weapon she was very familiar with, despite not seeing it used at battle. A very wide-bellied blade, made for hacking and slashing. No handle, no crossbar, just one continuous piece of red metal. The slaughter's blade oozing with crimson vapor pushed back against the cudgel. Wielding it was a massive anthropomorphic lion wearing exotic armor. Mike, wearing the slaughter's set, had appeared in her moment of need. Cudgel and blade started to shake when both fighters put more force into their locked weapons to gain the upper hand. Ultimately, it was the monkey mask that did a flip back to recover its stance and face the two chosen from Mina's march. "Be careful, Lydia. This monkey is a level above the other riffraff here. We should work together and end him quickly," Mike whispered to her, suggesting to go all out together with him, to finish the fight quickly. "What are you whispering? Are you worried for your woman?" "I will allow the woman to retreat, so we can have a proper battle," the cultivator offered honorably, as he vigilantly watched the two, ready to react. Lydia shot him a contemptuous look before she turned into the figure of a silver-blue anthropomorphic wolf, not any smaller than the lion. Wait a moment, 2 vs 1 doesn't sound fair, right?" Monkey Mask stuttered, visibly losing tension in his stance. It seemed like he just lost confidence in taking on the both of them. "Too bad, we at Minas Mar never prided ourselves on offering our opponents a fair fight," the lion said, exposing his big fangs with a grin, before charging at the cultivator, wielding his pair of slaughter blades, while Lydia changed to the bow, assuming the place of the rear guard. The sky above the Pythian village had turned into a battlefield, and it didn't look good for the cultivators. Epsilon's fleet that had appeared earlier shot down the flying barges one by one. The swarm of cultivators was under heavy fire, from arrows, magic, and bullets from the ground. The Elder of the Spirit-severing stage and above that could hold their own were fragmented, either fighting the allies of Minas Mar or trying to attack the enemy fleet. Forced to see his men get decimated in an ambush, the sect leader turned away from the barrier. With hatred burning in his eyes, he slashed the attacking python with a quick movement, so fast that barely anyone in the audience was able to see. The Guardian had shown a poor performance, but nobody expected things to just end. The situation above the city had given them hope, but now the only one that kept the immortal in check was gone. Umi's breath stopped and her heart sank. This was it. In shock, she watched the passive snake, as big as a crown scraper, crumble apart into massive chunks of ice. Python was slain. The Guardian of Little Gamma had fallen at the hand of a legendary adversary. In horror, the whole audience watched the death of Python, except for the Tower Master, who seemed frustrated rather than shocked. After getting rid of what only seemed like a nuisance to him, the sect leader of the Silk River sect turned to the barrier. Lifting his translucent ice saber, he slashed at the barrier, crumbling the 20-story-high ice walls. The actual impact could even be heard in the stadium, just moments after it appeared on the screen. What are we doing? The city barrier can only hold him back for so long. We can't face a legend of such strength. Umi finally snapped, giving in to the panic and showering the Tower Master with questions and worries. The Tower Master just held her an arm's length away from him and looked at the screen with a disappointed sigh. It seemed like this wasn't part of the plan. Chapter 1135 On the Streets. Lunacy and Madness. Haha. The Alliance leader slew the beast. The snake is gone. Once the leader is here, he will squash those ships with a flick of his wrist. Cheers could be heard above the city. It was a wave that propagated through the crowd of cultivators after some saw the victory of the immortal. Despite defending themselves against a deadly hail of artillery, the swarm of cultivators took the time to cheer and curse at their enemies, when they heard the banging in the barrier. In the distance, they could see the spires of ice blooming with every attack of their leader. Dumting also felt like the plan was getting back on track. The Alliance had some casualties, but nothing he cared for, or that could disrupt the plans. He was confident that once Yumama entered the city, it would be stomped in a single step. After all, what was a puny barrier to an immortal? It could buy them time at best. And after the Pythian village was flattened and the arena ravaged, there would be nothing stopping them from looting Little Gamma. Motivated, he finally decided to join the fray. With the tainted spiritual energy coursing through his body like a raging cyclone, the martial artist jumped down, to help the attack on the ranged units that had hampered their attack so far. He fell like a rock, landing in a cloud of wood splinter, as he shattered the roof he landed on. Before the dust settled, his massive fist, clad in spiritual energy and fist aura, crashed into the next best opponent. The resistance was surprising, as the weight of the man he targeted far surpassed what he expected. With a satisfying crunch, his torso gave way. But instead of blowing the shooter off the roof, he just tumbled back several steps and fell on his ass. Only up close did he realize that not all of them were covered in elaborate armor, but many were covered in a layer of metal scales. What kind of armor was that? It seemed fused to their bodies. Suddenly, all of their eyes were on him. He suddenly had a foreboding hunch. It didn't feel like he was looked at by enemies. He knew the gazes of anger and hatred. These looks were empty. Hostile, but empty. There were no emotions, just the determination to kill. The most shocking part was when the guy he had just beaten down, simply started standing up again. His chest was completely caved in from his earlier punch, but he rose from the ground as if he was fine. Accompanied by the sounds of resetting bones, his chest even started slowly bulging back out again. "Just what are you?" he mumbled just when he realized what they were. "Golems. The terrible puppets of Minas March." He had seen some during the games. They were existences similar to the monster puppets one of the participants used in the tournament. Tough opponents, but if they were similar to the monster puppets, then they could be broken. With unwavering mania, Dumting was ready to start his personal rooftop battle against the creatures of Minas Mar, however. "Back off, he is mine," a thunderous voice commanded the golem, and a small figure fell from the sky. They were barely the height of his knee in his current form. A diabolical grin appeared on his face. Despite the new silvery armor, shield, and axe, he recognized the midget he had tortured in the first round. His fight with the dwarf had forced him to reveal his cards early on, ruining his plan. But the memory still made him happy. It unshackled his restraints and continuously allowed him to gain experience and finally advance in the control of his energy. He wasn't able to kill the midget back then, but now he had the chance to repeat the scenario and bring it all to a glorious end. What a welcome reunion! For you to be my first kill once again, how symbolic, he commented, observing the dwarf. The only change he could make out was the equipment. His vertically challenged victim was now clad in a full suit of silver armor, fitted to his stature. Things will be different this time, the dwarf's voice rumbled. Seeing the unwavering conviction in the other's eyes, his smile vanished. He instinctively felt that this wasn't the same one he had destroyed a few days ago. Ding! You have been affected by encroachment of lunacy. Your conviction has risen. Poulter could feel it excessively clear. There should have been doubt in his mind. Just a few days ago this man had brutally tortured him to death. The memory was still vivid, he had not changed. There was no way the him now could take him down. There should have been doubt, but there wasn't. Just an unreasonable conviction. He had to do this and there was no way around it. He was thankful to Caleb for what he did, but it just soothed an itch he had to scratch himself. His fist clenched tightly onto the poleaxe and shield Seth had provided him. He was still unsure when Seth asked him to participate. He had hesitated when he saw the equipment the blacksmith had prepared for him, but his mind had cleared once he donned the armor and jewelry. The dwarf stopped worrying about guilt, about pride, or other people's opinions. There was only one path for him to take. He stepped forward with conviction and the unbending will of a dwarf. Without warning, the poleaxe rushed ahead, stabbing at Dumting's heart. Despite evading, blood dripped to the ground. He suffered a nasty gash across his chest from the blade of the poleaxe flying by. He had evaded the tip, not the blade. Dumting's eyes glared at him. He sneered, he was finally able to hurt him without difficulty. The martial artist didn't take this silently and upped his game. With terrifying speed and fist clad in the tainted, evil aura, he started a series of high-speed strikes to tenderize Poulter before the main course. Poulter didn't even bother blocking, using the gaps in the attacks to get his own. He held a shield, but had completely forsaken his defense in favor of offense. The giant fists landed on the silver armor, like meteor strikes. Yet, when the fists clad in swirls of dark power came in contact with the armor, the aura dissipated. Poulter felt the physical impact, but they were unable to deal any great harm to him. Instead, the moonstone gems on the armor shone slightly brighter. It seemed that the cultivator's spiritual armor was close enough to be countered by the same principles. Ding! You have been affected by encroachment of lunacy. Your conviction has risen. Poulter could not help the smirk on his lips. The difference was so great, it was exhilarating. The fist that had haunted his dreams was unable to so much as bruise him. The flames of conviction burned even brighter. He wanted to go even further. Ding! You have been affected by advance of madness. Your madness has risen. His poleaxe covered in the flames of bit deep into the hulk, splitting flesh and bone. He could feel the power running through his veins. Seth had roughly explained the effect, but Poulter had not expected how it would feel. With glee, he started turning Dumting into a bloody mess. It was not a one-sided fight. Poulter also suffered a lot, but he couldn't even register the damage he took. It didn't matter, it was of no concern to him at this point. In this arena, created by the surrounding golems, he was having his rematch and he was. The poleaxe in his hand was suddenly grabbed and a punch straight to the face took him off his feet. Looking up, he saw Dumting towering over him once again. His figure made it hard to believe he was alive. The deep cuts and bruises that covered his body, burning in dark flames, made it look like he was an undead who just crawled out of a fire pit. Despite what he looked like, he had just yanked the weapon from Poulter's hand and thrown it off the roof. His mind was blank. How did that happen? I can read it in your face. It's because you lost control. I just needed to play a little weak and what happened? I was easily able to disarm you, the cultivator said with a sadistic grin. Despite his condition, he enjoyed berating and belittling Poulter. I told you how this would end. It doesn't matter how much you try to prevent it, this will end with your death. This ill-fated karma will find its end, once I send you on your way, he monologued happily. No. This couldn't happen. Not again. The dwarf had to admit that he was right. He had lost himself in the power of the armor. He had fought barely using his technique or skills, like a brainless child drunk on power. Seth had warned him about the effects, but he had underestimated it. But Dum Ting also made a mistake. He decided to talk, giving Poulter the chance to regain clarity. He had lost his weapon, but he still had his shield. He was a shield saint, and he knew that there had to be a way. Ding! You have been affected by encroachment of lunacy. Your conviction has risen. Yes, there was always a way. Ding! You have been affected by advance of madness. Your madness has risen. Chapter 1136 On the streets. Harsh words. In the dim twilight of the setting sun, several adjacent streets had turned into a scene from a horror movie. Lifeless bodies suspended in semi-translucent goo, sticking to the pavement and buildings along the street. Slimes, thousands of them, had flooded the streets and apprehended everyone who resisted. In the center of the calamity, spanning several blocks, was a short, quirky-looking woman with shoulder-length black hair and a silver armor. Ellen Culpepper had unleashed the unholy wave of infamous trash mobs she had reared in the depths of Mina's March. Slimes had conquered part of the Pythian village, catching and killing enemies with unprecedented might. However, not everyone was killed. Ellie had made sure to differentiate. Although everyone ended up inside a slime, not everyone suffered the fate of slowly being dissolved by the slime's acidic insides. Ordinary people, players, and immigrants left in the village had been caught inside shell slimes, one of her special breeds, for their own safety. Under the organization of Love, she and the other members who had not left Earth had been dispatched outside the arena to take care of things in the village. It was their chance to farm power of existence. The other was the trump card, in case things went haywire. The foreboding knocking that shook the city, as massive strikes pounded the barrier from outside, quickened her actions. Even though many of the people here were not citizens of Earth, but immigrants from the Pathworks or the continent who set up shop here for the Pythian Games, they still had a certain responsibility for their safety. At least for the people who paid to open shop here. Fall. The slime rancher was busy directing the slimes to collect the spoils and bring civilians and non-hostiles to safety when suddenly all strength left her body. She had lost all control over herself, the moment the commanding word echoed in the street. Foo! She wanted to curse, but the air was pressed out of her as she crashed on the ground. It was embarrassing to admit, but she was weak to mental status effects like this. As a slime rancher, most of her AP were focused on the special control attribute she needed to tame beasts. There were also some in strength and agility, but all of her other attributes were rather pitiful. Especially willpower. Even with equipment, it wasn't any less pitiful. With a crappy multiplier on top, her resistance to mind attacks was. You are alone. Almost non-existent. Before she could command the slimes to defend her, the other spoke again. Sorrow struck her heart when she felt her connection to the slimes vanish. A deep feeling of loneliness overcame her. She felt helpless, she wanted to scream, thrash, and panic, but she couldn't fight the lethargy that came with the depression and sudden solitude. She knew it was an attack, but that didn't help. Even that was forgotten quickly as most thoughts came to a grinding halt, paralyzed by the emotions that hit her. With her thoughts flowing unwilling like viscous honey, she looked in the direction of the voice. There stood a man. She remembered this figure. Before her thoughts could fully recognize who it was. There is only darkness for you. She had lost her ability to see before her thoughts could connect the figure to her memory. And death for your people. She suddenly had the deep-seated conviction that everyone she knew and loved was doomed to die today. There was nothing they could do, even her strongest friends would find their end today. Hot tears streamed down her face, and she fell into darkness, unable to react to the footsteps that were coming closer. These cultivators are just the beginning. We have a terrible army that will raise Earth until all lights of resistance are extinguished, the figure spoke sadistically, now much closer. They were clearly happy to torture her like this. Her dim mind was filled with the others' amused laughter, torturing her with illusions. She didn't know how long her mind was filled with the sound, but it suddenly stopped. Sluggishly her thoughts realized the silence. Moments earlier. What do you think you are doing? Shay exclaimed wrathfully as he entered the slimed street. Before him he saw Briga, the chosen of Bragi who had come to Earth to participate in the grand tournament, chuckling over the limp body of his girlfriend. He reacted instinctively. The moment Briga turned around, his mouth opened to speak, a bubble of water formed around his head, silencing all words. The wielder of the voice was instantly struggling not to drown, kneeling on the ground. "Keep him trapped, I will look after the girl," Twinkle said and walked past him. According to the goblin's instruction, Shay used the water to not just silence, but also bind Briga. The shaman who had followed him here started casting spells and skills on Ellie. "She is okay, physically at least. She suffered some terrible status ailments, but she will be back on her feet soon," the shaman shared his prognosis. Shay's heart lightened again, but the moment of carelessness was immediately used, as Briga suddenly attacked him with a dagger. The water mage managed to parry with his staff in time, but he was still baffled by the sudden attack. Although initially effective, the bubble of water over his head had suddenly lost the power to drown him. Had he suddenly learned water breathing? No, it had to be more, as not even his water restraints were able to hold him down. Summoned by the clanking of weapons, Twinkle Rainborn also joined the fight. The small goblin wasn't an imposing sight, but he was incredibly adept and versatile in melee combat as much as he was in spell casting and shamanism. It was not a long, or spectacular fight, as Briga didn't even last a minute against the two. Ultimately, he lost consciousness after a devastating bonk of the shaman's fetish on the back of his head. To prevent any other surprises, Shay trapped him in a massive, revolving water prison, where he was thrown around like a cloth in a washing machine. A warm feeling flooded her consciousness, bringing light and warmth back to her. And sight. Ellen's thoughts were suddenly able to race again, as she took in the scene before her. She saw Shay, wearing the same lunacy set as her, controlling a massive ball with water floating in the air. Beside her loved one, stood a goblin in an exotic outfit with lots of feathers and a staff. Was that the goblin shaman? Then she noticed a figure being thrown around in the currents of the water ball. Finally, she was able to reconnect with her memory and recognize who it was. The chosen of Bragi who participated in the grand tournament. Now, the weird power that had thrown her into despair made sense. But why? No, she knew the reason. Although her mind was lethargic at the time, she still remembered what the terrible voice had told her. This attack was just the beginning. They would come with a terrible army to raise Earth. Bragi was a spy, and by the way he talked, probably from Spacia. It fit together with what they knew about the organization behind the attack of the Sect Alliance. Spacia using the Pythian game to smuggle in some of their people fit the bill just nicely. They had to warn the others. Maybe there were more participants that intended to cause trouble? She hurriedly got on her feet. Still weak in the knees, she stumbled only to be caught by Shay, who rushed to her side. "We have to warn everyone. If Briga is a spy from Spacia, then others. We know. Why do you think we rushed over here?" Ah. Chapter 1137 On the streets Blaze Road. A stream of fire shot through the gap between buildings, covering the whole street, not leaving any room for escape. Yet, when the flames subsided, there was a streak of road, untouched by the terrible flame. At its tip stood a tall, lean man, wielding a sword. It was covered in a blue sword aura. He had split the attack, leaving him completely unharmed. Marcel had tried to end things quickly, because of the knocking on the barrier, but it seemed like his opponent didn't agree. A swordsman wielding the powers of fire. "And you were with a woman using ice earlier, you must be Marcel, of the Boulder Guild, right?" he asked calmly, returning to a different sword stance. "I didn't think I would be so unlucky to come across one of our priority targets," he said with a smug smile and charged at Marcel. He was not running, but each step was unnaturally long. Was this why they called some techniques ground shrink? He didn't have the time for idle thoughts. He blew out his breath and parried the sword that was coming for his heart. The metal cried when the two weapons, one clad in a calm blue, the other in a fiery orange aura, collided. The force that assailed his arm was tremendous. It was like blocking the paw of a giant monster, just that the monster was his size and grinned him in the face, as it kept driving the weapon forward. Marcel and the cultivators locked eyes in this short moment before a bloom of fire forced the opponent to jump back. His shoulder was charred and his robes were singed. He stared at Marcel vigilantly, as his sword had suddenly turned into a pillar of fire. The surprise attack was unable to take him out, but the wound would obstruct him from fully using his skills. "Well done, Whitehilt," he thought. "Thanks, partner," Whitehilt answered happily. Originally, Marcel had been depressed. Despite being chosen by a god, it was not a very strong one. Faya, the god of flames, lacked the power to give Marcel a legendary material. He also told the swordsman, that there was yet to appear a fitting material on earth. At the question of why he couldn't buy one from the auction house, the god stayed rather quiet about the why but insisted that it wouldn't count and couldn't be done. Marcel comforted himself with the fact that even stronger gods like Tyr or Mahis send their champions on quests to get local materials. He was jealous of Lydia, who had even gotten 2 materials from her god. But that was in the past. A few months ago, Seth had suddenly called him saying he might have a weapon for him. When he came to the embassy, the blacksmith had wordlessly handed this sword to him, indicating for him to grab the hilt. It was a weird gesture at first, but when Marcel took hold of white hilt, he immediately understood. The sword was an ego weapon, that could not just choose its owner passively. Had it not liked him, it could have set him on flames then and there. Luckily, he lived to grow a great partnership with his new weapon. Since he was able to let go of his regrets concerning his divine patron, he was able to make leaps and bounds in his training, raising his level alone in the abyss. Swinging the almost 4-meter-long pillar of fire, Marcel pursued the cultivator. White hilt was a relic with a chance of becoming a legend, as long as it was nurtured by the deeds of its owner. So all Marcel had to do now was make a name for himself and the sword, to attain a legendary weapon. Its flame sword effect, coupled with Marcel's blessing from a god of fire and fire affection, turned the sword clad in flames, into a massive pillar, like a supersized lightsaber. It was great to leave a lasting image, on top of being incredibly powerful. The fire swept by the cultivator, who barely managed to block it with an aura of spiritual energy. And this was the perfect place to gain recognition. Marcel and Elsa had rushed here when they heard what was about to happen in Little Gamma. Primarily to help, but if helping came with Pathworks-wide recognition, there was no reason to complain. Again and again, the pillar of flames sought to incinerate the opponent, who persistently managed to escape with his life, time and time again. However, the cultivator tired quickly. Thanks to the initial burn, he couldn't perform his swordsmanship correctly and accrued wounds with every encounter. "Let's end this," White Hilt cheered, as the cultivator had finally fallen to his knees. He was a strong opponent. Without Withelt's ability to independently use its skills, Marcel would have had a hard time fighting him. Following the sword's suggestion, Marcel aimed for the final strike, when he felt a sharp pain at his waist, right below the rib cage. He struck to his side, but his attacker had already backed away. It was a female cultivator wearing a dark outfit. "Ding! You have been afflicted with foreign chi." Looking down on himself, he found that a small knife had snaked its way through the gaps in his armor. The woman had stabbed him through a gap at his waist, aiming for his kidneys. Looking back at her, she already had another 2 similar knives in her hands. "Are you okay?" she asked the man on the ground without taking her eyes off Marcel. "So you weren't alone," Marcel spoke out the obvious, as he pulled out the dagger. The wound was not big, it had barely cost him any health. It would heal without even using a potion. The worst point was the foreign chi. It was shown as a status ailment, that had various effects on him, mostly lowering his attributes by a few points. This was the first time Marcel experienced these effects, but apart from a slight nausea, he felt no immediate effects. "There are actually 3 of us," another bloke revealed himself, stepping out from the shadows. He had a huge, crude cudgel with studs resting on his shoulder. "Where were you when I was beating him? Why are you only coming out of the woodwork when I'm about to kill him?" Marcel asked jokingly, his thoughts racing to calculate his odds of victory. 3 vs 1 was a bit much, but one of them was already out of commission. 2 vs 1, maybe. It would be hard if they had the same level as him, but maybe he could manage. "We would be blamed if he died on us," the bloke answered, shrugging his shoulders. "What touching camaraderie," Marcel commented sarcastically. He deliberated, calling for backup. "Just attack him. I will take care of Suol." The woman berated the bloke and the latter rushed at Marcel. Round 2 began. This guy was a little slower than the lean swordsman, but the first time he parried the club, Marcel quickly learned that parrying the massive club was no good. The velocity behind the club almost broke his wrist, when he tried to redirect the attack. "Wow, that hurt a little. An ordinary sword might have broken. We should change strategy," the sword advised, unwilling to take any more such strikes. The chosen of Fia nodded. They couldn't compete in brute force with this guy, so some brains were needed. Holding the sword at his side, the tip aimed at the bloke, Marcel used a divine skill. Starting from his feet, he was clad in a foreboding flame. The club wielder hesitated to get closer, observing the swordsman vigilantly. Quicker than the wind, Stishflam, the swordsman exclaimed and vanished. The bloke saw a flash of light and hurriedly evaded. An ignorant smile surfaced when he thought that he had successfully evaded the attack he couldn't clearly see. Only a straight streak of the burning road indicated Marcel's path. The smile quickly vanished when his eyes followed the trail and saw the sword aimed at him stuck in the chest of the cultivator Sool, who was being treated by their companion. His female companion could also watch in shock, as Sool was incinerated. 1 down, 2 to go. Chapter 1138. On the streets Hale Road. 2 to go, were big words he came to regret. After killing his original opponent in a surprise attack, he now found himself to be the main focus for the two newcomers, and neither of them was weaker than the swordsman cultivator. Since their comrade was dead, he now faced both of them at the same time. Maybe it wasn't the best idea to get rid of the weakest threat, but at the time he felt it was better than having to fight all three later on. While the bloke kept driving him back with powerful club techniques, the female cultivator would wait for openings to start sneak attacks like her original attack, when she stabbed him through the gaps in his armor. It didn't help his concentration, that the banging echoing through the city kept becoming louder. The fiery swordsman was able to survive, but he wasn't doing well in the 2-on-1. Many of his skills needed a certain initial time or sequence to show their full effect, which he wasn't given. He mostly relied on swordsmanship, expert, and the effects of White Hill to keep his own in the unfair fight. Let's do that. I'm sure it will give us a chance, White Hill suggested, to use the strongest skill it had. You are right. I doubt it could kill either of them, but I'm sure it will give us an opportunity, the swordsman agreed. Although it was not the first White Hilt that Edward currently used, it was the second and was originally wielded by Marco. It didn't share the legendary material or Ixion's enchantment, but it was almost identical in every other aspect, such as Ember Rain. Marcel exclaimed the name of the skill, using it together with White Hilt. It also had Ember Rain, a skill that resembled the spell of Fire Rain, then summoned down a rain of fireballs in a limited area of effect, as the name suggested. However, coupled with the blessing of Fia and Fire Affinity, massive fireballs came falling from the sky, like the burning parts of orbital trash that fell to the planet's surface. The impacts destroyed surrounding buildings and blew craters in the street. It took 5 seconds to completely channel the skill before Marcel was able to move. This seemed like an eternity in a high-octane battle, but his opponents had other problems. Swinging his club, the bloke actually parried one of the embers, only to be enveloped by a bloom of fire and it exploded. Even if it didn't end him, it was hard to believe he would get unscathed. The female similarly, was busy evading the falling debris of the building collapsing left and right. The moment the 5 seconds were over, Marcel charged Stishflam once again, aiming for the female cultivator emerging from the curtain of collapsing buildings. He vanished from where he stood, leaving a blazing trail behind him. Blazing right past the woman, who made a step back at the last possible moment. She was smiling, ready to give a snarky comment when she realized that she had not evaded because of luck or skill. Marcel had his next skill already cocked and read. With a wide swing of his black, he created a crescent of intensely glowing wire that grew in all directions and shot off from the 4-meter-long flame sword in his hands. It was not just simply a wave of fire, as it combined the heat of the flame with the sharpness of the sword. The air, the dust, surrounding debris of stone, wood and steel, were cut and melted by the disk of sharp fire. The female cultivator had no time for an elegant evasion, as she jumped straight up in the air, making a hurried flip forward. Her roll on the ground was followed by a painful groan. She had been slightly too late, losing the tip of her left foot to the disk of fire. Her dagger ready, her angry eyes focused on Marcel, she was ready to charge at and kill him with everything she had. Again, too late. Now that Marcel had the chance, he was chaining his attacks one after the other. By the time she was back on her feet, White Hilt's burning strike was already descending on the top of her head. She still tried to throw herself out of the way, succeeding at only losing her right arm, shoulder, and some bits of the torso. The right half of her body burning like tinder, she rolled over the ground, away from the swordsman. Marcel clicked his tongue. When he followed after her to give her the final strike, he already saw that the attack would fail. In the shadows of the fire covering the street, he saw the figure of the bloke charging over with big, flowing steps. His robes were burning, his flesh singed, and he was ignoring the fire and smoke on the street to come to her side and save his fellow disciple. It was almost touching if it wasn't for the fact that they were crazy murderers from Marcel's perspective. If he followed through with his attack, he would receive the cudgel straight to the skull. He kinda doubted his survival of that attack. Change of plan, he aimed to confront the bloke, instead of ending the halved fairy. He would use his hurry to defend her. He would act like he didn't notice him, aim for the girl at first, and change the trajectory of his attack in the last moment, to stab the bloke right through his throat. Just a few steps separated them from each other. Marcel was ready to yank up Whitehill to end the bloke when the debris and ruins to the left of them suddenly exploded. A cold wind blew over the street, creating a storm of fire and smoke, stopping either of the parties. At the same time, the figure of a man was catapulted through the gap between Marcel and the two cultivators, creating a trench between them before coming to a halt. The fiery swordsman vigilantly glanced at the newcomer. His robes were in tatters and a deformed silver mask hid half of what looked like a very handsome face, after a beating and suffering from frostbites. The two parties were still frozen in shock, trying to make heads and tails from the sudden change in the situation, when another figure came through the new opening in the ruins. Marcel! Are you okay? Elsa called out, her usually cold and emotional voice somewhat thought in concern for her lover. His heart beat faster, recognizing her concerned face. He quickly wanted to tell her that he was okay, but he still had to watch out for the bloke and what seemed to be Elsa's original opponent. I saw the ember rain coming down and thought you were in danger, she added when she found Marcel still standing upright with only minor wounds. It wasn't easy, but I managed against those three, he explained a little embarrassed. Elsa frowned. Ding! Elsa has invited you to her party. Do you want to join Elsa's party? Y/N. Let's take them down together, and she was in the middle of her sentence when Marcel suddenly charged at her. For a moment she thought he would hug her, but he actually parried a spike of dark red energy. The man on the ground shot her. To think you would ignore this one to flirt with your boy toy. I thought we had something special, he stated as he released himself from the embrace of the ground and wiped the dust off his tattered robes. She shot the man a frigid glance. Let's end these guys together and move on, she finished her sentence as if she wasn't just interrupted rudely. You have joined Elsa's party. Let's do it quickly. Chapter 1139 On the Streets Puppet Theatre. Finn, Bulko, Lixus, go to the north. The golems report a huge number of unknown creatures rampaging over there. Mina, please go northwest. The Saintess of Gatries was seen going rampant. Love distributed the remaining members of Yule Cat's Fur to the hot spots on their map. The super secretary with the moniker of the Wise was acting as the focus of the command center, directing the members of Minas Mar from the arena. While mostly the mercenaries and risen to the skies, many of the other members had entered the city on the ground to contain the chaos on the streets. Roger, their answers echoed from the COMM link. It was hard for the northern part of the Pythian village to come into view, as little more than a field of ruins was left. What they did see were a bunch of exotic figures and beasts moving through the debris, hunting foreigners still left in the Pythian village. Not to eat. Unconscious or dead people were shoved into massive baskets the beast carried on their backs. Curiously, it almost looked like a harvest festival, just that the fruits being picked were people. Quite macabre. In this place, there were many inns and restaurants that were built by people who migrated to Earth to do business during the games. As such, these were mostly ordinary buildings and not tree houses, like the ones in the tree stations. The buildings built here fell apart like matchstick houses when faced with these creatures. Hey, don't those look familiar? Bulko asked suspiciously as they got closer. They were not monsters they knew from their own home world, nor did they resemble anything they had heard about. Where could they have? Don't they look like the puppet beasts that one cultivator used? Finn asked unsure. Racking her brain for the name of the guy. Wasn't it Long Huan, Long Jian, something like that? Lixus tried to come up with the name. Long Jian. That was the name. So he was with the Silk River sect, hey. Bulko remembered when the half-elf mentioned it. Let's pick up the speed and get rid of them quickly, the fairy brute said, looking forward to a battle. The other two agreed and they sped up their alpaca, closing in on the horde of beasts. Long Jian was quite happy that he had followed the sect alliance here. Well, technically he was here first, but he wouldn't have come if they had not asked him. Of course, it was beneath him to actually collude with the Silk River sect. He was only here because it benefited him. Whether the sect alliance was winning in the fights above or not, was of no concern to him. It wasn't often that he got his hand on such good quality research materials. While the alliance was distracting Minas Mar, he would fill his bags with materials and make off before anything untoward happened. Was what he thought, until he started losing connection to several of his puppets. The people in this place were not weak, which was the whole reason for his harvest. Losing a few mid-grade puppets like Break Wind Wolves or Iron Armadillos wasn't weird, nor did he care for the cheap products. However, his heart jumped when he suddenly lost the connection to his Millennium Bull. The Millennium Bull was one of his upper-grade puppets, one of the first he had gotten from the sect. When it was alive, the Millennium Bull was a terrifying monster in the spirit-severing realm. Its puppet was slightly weaker in spiritual energy, but he had used precious materials to further strengthen its body. Imbued with a strand of his divine consciousness, it was even able to act alone and make intelligent decisions. Despite not being his strongest puppet, it was a shock to find out that there was someone able to defeat it in the area. Waving his hand, he brought out a new puppet. It was a massive pig, easily 4 to 5 stories tall. Its skin had a golden sheen to it. Golden Boar, go take a look. If they fought the Millennium Bull, they must be weakened now. Kill them and bring back their bodies and the Millennium Bull, he instructed his puppet. The bull could be repaired, and if he got the body of its killer on top of it, he still gained something. After sending the pig to finish it, he didn't pay any more attention, confident that the Golden Boar would soon return victorious. Even when he lost the connection with more cheap puppets, he didn't mind and kept collecting the bodies that the other puppets brought to him. The confidence held true, until he lost connection with the Golden Boar, too. When the Golden Boar didn't return, Long Jian became a little upset. The bull and the boar were both rewards he got for sect missions, losing them like this irked him. I will have to go personally, he finally decided, and jumped on the back of his Bright Moon Wolf, a beast puppet he often used as a mount because of its superior speed on the ground. It didn't take long for him to reach the place, where the remnant of the Golden Boar were still burning. The massive beast was sprawled across the street. The hardened shell and bones were burning with terrifying flames, but what had ended the puppet was that its reinforced skull was brutally crushed. Long Jian swallowed hard. What was the Golden Boar? Although it wasn't his strongest puppet, it was able to fight someone at the peak of the spirit-severing stage with just its durability. An opponent that was able to crush its skull, was someone he had to be careful of. Well, if it isn't Long Jian. To think one of our participants would do something like this, he heard a high voice speak out, disappointed. His head turned around, to see a tiny figure stand on a windowsill above. She was hard to spot. If it wasn't for her bright hair reflecting the shine of the fire on the street, he wouldn't have been able to make her out. He remembered her from the information he was given about Mina's march. Finn, the fairy, one of the concubines of the Tower Master. Long Jian raised his guard, circulating the spiritual energy in his body. The information mentioned that she was strong in melee combat. It must have been her that had crushed the Golden Boar. The Millennium Bull was probably her doing, too. If she attacked, he was ready to defend and distract her with his best puppets. Are you really not going to say anything in your defense? Well, not that there could be any valid excuse, right? She kept rambling on with a carefree voice. Long Jian scowled and then scoffed. What was there to apologize for? He knew too well, that this world practiced weird customs. The rights of the weak, what a stupid notion. The puppet maker knew perfectly well, that if it wasn't for the agreement between the sects and the secular powers, nobody would stop their sect from collecting materials among the commoners. How much quicker could they advance if they had more supply to practice? Just the materials he collected today would allow the human puppet techniques of his sects to advance by leaps and bounds. The elders would finally be able to research to their heart's desire. The fresh disciples would finally be able to collect real experience, instead of having to risk their lives outside with half-baked skills to secure mediocre materials for practice. But these people, they treated the lives of these scums as something precious. They had destroyed his puppets for strangers they didn't even know. As if they could be talked into agreeing with his actions. While the little humanoid was still talking, Long Jian had already commanded for all the puppets in the surroundings to gather at his location. He would swamp her with numbers and flee. Suddenly the collapsed buildings to his left exploded as a blade of wind passed through. He was still planning to counter Finn, so the attack caught him off guard. It was too late to dodge. Since he couldn't evade, a towering figure appeared beside him. It was a huge man, easily 2 meters tall, wearing a striking green armor. Wielding a brutal guandao, he faced the wind blade, his beard waving in the wind. If someone looked closely, beyond the beard, his skin was dried and reinforced, like that of a mummy. This was his strongest puppet, gifted to him by the sect leader for his protection. The Emerald Mountain Emperor had jumped forward to save his life. Chapter 1140 Overload. The air was hot and heavy, it was hard to breathe, but the technicians did their best, running around the shield bunker, replacing foci and cooling down formation lines. We can't manage for much longer. If we don't deactivate, the formation will melt, and the generator overheat. Everything here may explode, a technician cried out to the golem standing at the control panel. Azatane observed the people running around as the golem processed the words of the technician. The shield generator Azatane was in charge of was close to exploding under the pressure. Usually, this pressure was shared with the array of generators that created the barrier covering the Pythian village. Deactivating the generator would not be a problem, usually. The advantage of a barrier with an array of generators was that if one generator fell out, the barrier would weaken, but not fall. They could cycle for maintenance and save power when there was no immediate threat. However, if their generator was like this, then all others were experiencing this, too. The knocking of the immortal outside was quickly bringing their door to the edge of its durability. If he shut down their shield generator, the barrier would weaken and the load they were currently taking would be directly redistributed to all others. The result, immediate extermination. All other shield bunkers but this one would explode and the barrier would completely fall. Well, look what we have here. A nice little field, ready for a harvest, a voice suddenly echoed across the crowd assembled at the crossing between the barrier of the Pythian village and that of Little Gamma. People who were unwilling to fight, but couldn't cross into Little Gamma, enter the prepared shelters, or didn't dare to leave the Pythian village before the barrier became a prison, had gathered in this place. There were also about 30 local guards from Little Gamma. Several members of the guilds had also found their way here. Everyone looked at the figure trudging down the empty main street leading up to the crossing between barriers. It wasn't a huge figure, but rather scrawny and toned. Their body was covered by a ribbed, hooded robe and bandages. In their hand, they held a peculiar, rusty saber. "What are you doing here, priest of corruption?" Tiny of Gamma Resistance stepped forward, his massive hammer resting on his shoulder. The figure came to a halt, staring at the chosen of Magni blocking his path. "Just claim some souls for Mother. These maggots of the Cloud Continent are a great harvest." He clearly voiced his intention to slaughter all the foreigners present here. Tiny sighed, taking the massive hammer from his back. "Don't tell me you are going to stand in the way of my holy right," the priest said, almost disappointed of Tiny's decision to protect them. Tiny scratched his cheek. "It's not like I'm particularly interested in protecting them, but I have a reputation to protect for Gamma Resistance as the vice leader, you know," he answered a little irresponsible. "I see, well then. Corruption Knight, take care of him for me." "What are you?" Tiny was rudely interrupted by an 8-meter tall beast in armor, slapping him away, sending him crashing into the next row of buildings, just to pursue his target the next moment. With Tiny out of the way, the priest turned to the crowd of cultivators. "You seem to take us for a bunch of sheep ready for slaughter," one of them stepped forward, unsheathing his sword. After all, they had the strength and standing that allowed him to come to Earth and they had survived this hostile world so far. Just because they were unwilling to fight a fight that wasn't theirs, didn't mean they were weak or cowards. At least not all of them. "Right, Guard Kong, slay that guy for me," someone else ordered their bodyguard. Following their example, roughly a third stepped forward to face him. They roughly knew his abilities from the tournament. They just had to make sure not to be hit by the weird saber, then. The priest suddenly vanished from their vision. Covered in glowing tattoos he appeared right in front of Guard Kong. The man was still able to react. Lifting his sword to block the rusty saber, only to witness it instantly wither and break. He would have died then and there, if the priest wasn't suddenly thrown back. Showing a similar figure as Tiny earlier, the priest crashed into a nearby building. At the helm of the crowd stood the still pissed and tired-looking Kate Albright. Her hand had turned into a massive disfigured claw, dripping with the blood of the priest. The crowd could only look on in shock, as Kate appearing was even faster than the priest disappearing. They were still in a stupor when they heard the rebel move. The priest groveled out from the gravel of the destroyed building. On the man's exposed chest were 4 distinct claw marks, bleeding profusely. The flesh around them was squirming, as if it was trying to heal them, but was unable to do so. Dark, sickly veins spread out from these claw marks. "Ugh, how could this be?" the priest moaned, finding that the wounds were not healing as they should have. Looks like I won't even need to use my path to kill you. I can just cut you into ribbons," Kate said a little disappointed. Her Rakshasa claws were able to damage the soul, and it seemed that even the priest of corruption couldn't easily counter this damage. She had been kind of looking forward to unleashing the power of her path for the first time, facing a worthy opponent. It seems like you are right, he agreed, touching the open wound. The dark veins were quickly receding as his body countered the poison of her claws, but it had a hard time closing the wounds. There is no point in fighting then, the priest said decisively. He gave her a friendly wave and ran away, leaving the stumped Kate and the crowd behind. A moment later, the barrier protecting the Pythian village and keeping the cultivators inside, disintegrated. Tisk, looks like simply don't want to go my way, she sighed. A little while earlier. Requesting immediate, simultaneous shutdown of all shield generators because of overheating. Requesting immediate, simultaneous shutdown of all shield generators because of overheating. Requesting immediate, simultaneous shutdown of all shield generators because of overheating. Dozens of golems contacted the VIP lounge of Minas Mar, which had turned into a temporary command center. The messages from the golems stationed at the shield generators came flowing in incessantly, and all of them were the same, requesting to shut down the barrier immediately to prevent the generators and lives from being lost. Things inside the barrier were going as planned. The allied troops of Earth with the mercenaries and members of Minas Mar at their helm, were decimation the swarm of cultivators who lost the protection of their leader. However, said leader was posing a tremendous threat outside the barrier, to the point that their shield generators were failing. The moment they lowered this defense, the immortal would rush in, and who knew what he would do? Just decimating Minas Mar's troops would have been the friendly option. The only problem with this was their unwillingness to show that they also had two immortals on their side. Xiong Peng and Yu had both revealed that they were also immortals, so they were on the same stage as the alliance leader, just older with more experience and power. Lena, Mary, and the other members of the command central were discussing, hesitating to deactivate the barrier, when Seth's voice suddenly cut cleanly through the chaotic noise. Shut down the generators. It will be okay.